Hello everybody, Dante here. Today I'm going to talk about light language. What is light language? And answer a question, is light language a form of cultural appropriation? Light language is a transmission of energy that comes through in a non-rational, non-linguistic verbal expression. Uh, Light language is also called speaking in tongues by some. It's called glossolalia. It can happen automatically in certain states of consciousness, and it can be then used to enter back into that state of consciousness or support other people in entering that state of consciousness. These are non-rational, even non-linear, multidimensional states of consciousness. We enter these states of consciousness when we are able to deactivate the rational thinking mind that is normally in control and running our lives. In this state, we go beyond the parts of our brain that are normally thinking and keeping us very focused here and now in our present set of ego and belief systems. It's helpful to enter this state, and we go into this state in deep meditation and in medicine ceremonies and things of this nature. Sometimes people use these languages in order to channel a specific being or send or transmit a specific energy to somebody. Sometimes people can use this language to speak with different entities or speak with entities that might be attached to a particular person to help that person establish a connection with those entities and transform that relationship. Sometimes people get translations for what the light language means, and they're able to use light language in their form of channeling so that they can say something in light language and then provide the translation afterwards. Everybody has their own way of doing this, so I'm listing a lot of different possibilities. The best thing to understand this is to experience it. So I'm going to share a bit of light language with you now. No manala akataramo shoko darabasi katauhu fi kataramo hila shi kataramo sonu kutu kalapakatruno no namakatamu ni makata palakatarnish katawoko tapaka ashke tawoko talari rapoko tuika puira ni no 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 oni mananana eka taramokotoroto koshe namalokotara inamalokotaramak ilakataramokoto o lak esh kataramok oya ak inamokotronika ilamunanamane ne oni ne na ana no mone no shekatramo ola ka ila katramo no moso to oya kala shekatramo sonda kawala harakata anish katramo koya namo hoya la katrana no so koto la ash katramo ne makatramo momokoya Ishkatramono namakota labakani kata onomone na lamo la katramana na sao kola bashkatramoni makaala. Kila katramo hoi ni oye nae katranamo ok eshkatramo eshk ikala ole ba ala ali kata namo kotua katawa kola rina na namoishka. Uni no oi kata. Ila mongo na manangana na moko ta wokosh ke sao no ko ta wala poko makata. Kila katramono na makota makata. She katramoko palakata ni so ko to poko hoya. She katramoko. Tai. Okay. Yeah, that was a little 2 minutes of light language for you. For me, the experience of bringing that through is like blissful, it's trance-like, it feels like a strong energy flow through my body. My body kind of starts to move in these ways with it as well. And yeah, it's to transmit that same kind of blissful flowing energy to people. And I use this a lot in cacao ceremonies and sound healings, sometimes in personal sessions, sometimes when I sit in medicine ceremony, it's a way that I can release energy too. So that's my take on it, but everyone's going to have a bit of a different take. Now, explaining more about this So cultures around the world use this to enter trance and in different shamanic states. And it's not unique to any one culture, much like so many of the practices of what we call shamanism. Also consider, when we're talking about the idea of appropriation, shamanism is an appropriated word that has now become so commonplace that the medicine keepers of even South America use that word when that word is not a part of their culture at all. That's a Mongolian word. So this is where, when we start to say this is appropriation, that's appropriation, it becomes a little bit dicey, because if we've decided as a collective that we're appropriating a word to the point that now other medicine carriers are using a word from a culture that's thousands and thousands of miles away from them, maybe appropriating things is a natural part of human consciousness. So anyway, many cultures use this, and also beyond the cultural standpoint, when people enter into these non-ordinary or altered states of consciousness, even without a shamanic background, this way of communicating comes about spontaneously. I know a number of people who have never had any experience with this before, and all of a sudden they interact with a certain medicine, and this is coming through them as a way to work with the medicine, as a way to sit with it. Because sometimes when we're going through really intense experiences, we need a way to be able to hold ourselves through that experience, and this light language is a very powerful way of doing that. Now, this is also common in Christian churches in the South, and a friend of mine suggests, and I believe there's a lot of validity to this, that where this came from is the slaves from Africa that were brought over and were a part of that southern culture for some time. And this shamanic energy and practice was not erased as they emigrated and were Christianized. Emigrated, were forced to be slaves and brought across the ocean. Horrible. But nonetheless, it couldn't be erased from them. And perhaps these white slave owners observed this and considered that a way of the Holy Spirit speaking through them. And then they did appropriate it into their religion. So that's a good thing to note as well, is that just because you are entering into altered states of consciousness and you're experiencing high frequency energy does not mean that your own negative belief systems or oppressive belief systems are erased simply because you're experiencing bliss. You can experience bliss, and you can experience a very distorted bliss, and unfortunately that's incredibly common. So light language, speaking in tongues, glossolalia, it's an amazing tool, though it doesn't replace anything else. And just, if you do this as a meditation or listen to this, it won't replace your inner work, it won't replace your shadow work, and it won't replace looking at your own stuff and garbage and cleaning it up, because that's part of the path. Now, is this cultural appropriation? If something happens automatically when somebody enters into a certain state of consciousness beyond their conscious control, how could that be appropriation? If something arises naturally and spontaneously within the body and within the mind, that's part of the human experience. And it's almost as if you're saying somebody having a Kundalini awakening experience is also culturally appropriating, because this Kundalini awakening experience is spoken about in Indian texts. So this is a spontaneous transmission of energy. And in that sense, it can't really be cultural appropriation. Your light language might be influenced by the light languages that you hear from others, though everybody's going to have their own way of entering into this light language transmission. I found that because I spent a lot of time in Guatemala around Mayan languages, I naturally appropriated some of their ways of making sounds. But the thing is if I try to do that without going into light language, I don't have that in my vocal palette. I can't make those sounds. But when I go into that altered state that is kind of like a hairline away, but does require me to switch from English thinking into this sort of other kind of etsmarat ik ashkaramukot kind of a thing, then it's coming in. But if I'm just, trying to talk and want to make these sounds, like, they don't come naturally to me, and I don't even think necessarily, like, in this state of consciousness, how do I make that sound? It's a different part of my brain. And so we are a product of everything that comes into our consciousness. And we're influenced by all of this information, especially when we go into altered states. This information and these sounds and this visual impressions and all of it that is going into our brain then gets translated into the visions and communications that we're having. And this is why we need to be very careful of what information we ingest, and also understand the great value of having diverse and novel experiences. Scientific studies show that novel experiences is the number one factor in preventing Alzheimer's and dementia and cognitive loss of the brain. So this means when we do repetitive things and when we stay in routines and we stay in the familiar all the time, we're actually dumbing down our brain and we're decreasing our ability to remember and contain information. When we're trying new things and going to new places and exploring all the information, all the possibilities that are out there in the world, we're expanding our brain capacity, we're making ourselves able to hold more, and we're naturally opening ourselves to have many different kinds of perspectives that can then help us to see the world in completely new ways. So I'm sharing this video in part because I was at a gathering last weekend, and I was one of several people teaching about light language in a workshop, and somebody brought up a question of what if somebody hears this language and they are offended and feel that this is an insult to their culture or a culture. And I was not in the best space when I heard this question, and it arose some frustration in me, and I reflected back to this person that a lot of the people presenting were part of minority groups and part of other cultures, and they clearly don't have a problem with this practice. So that wasn't what I naturally should have done. Naturally, what I should have done is explained everything contained in this video. And this is a lesson for me in learning how to respond to people who come with this critical or judgmental energy in more compassionate ways. It's this way that when we're judging the judgment, we are actually instigating an energy battle, a power struggle. And so judgment can't be defeated with judgment. Judgment can be defeated with compassion. When we meet that judgment with compassion, so much magic happens. And there is no more conflict. And this is the energy that we need in all of these different conversations when people are misunderstanding each other and each other's intentions. And I felt really bad about this afterwards, and I'd wish that I was able to take time to be present and be still, having that conversation. I would have been had I had the chance to include my daily meditation practice before I did this session that day. However, I had to show up really early in the morning to introduce that I was teaching this workshop, followed by immediately going to the workshop. And these kinds of environments are amazing, but when I'm put under these kinds of responsibilities that prevent me from following my own routine, I still manage to get stressed out. And I recognize that in a more balanced state that I'm working towards, I don't always need the practice before showing up in a balanced way, and that the practice is a permission slip that is teaching me gradually how to maintain that energy state of openness and compassion all the time. And I'm human, I make mistakes, and I am working on it. Now, I want to say a little bit even more about this concept of cultural appropriation. And by definition, cultural appropriation is in everything, right? It's a fact of what is happening in this world, that cultures adopt things from other cultures. We take plants from different parts of the world and then incorporate them in our culture. Coffee, chocolate, for big examples, tobacco, they're now around the world. And it's really kind of nasty when tobacco companies like American Spirit use symbols of Native Americans as their branding to promote the use of a product in the way that the natives of this land hadn't used it, to do something that is ultimately harmful to the consumer, yet somehow normalize it but draw people in by playing to some sort of admiration of this native culture that people have on some level without really backing up these native cultures. And that's kind of scary. And we see this with a lot of, that's one example, but there's so many companies who use cultural appropriation in a really negative and nasty way. However, there's a lot of people that are woke to the extreme, and I am not against being woke and that term and any of that. I think it's really important that we are woke. Woke comes from civil rights movement and Black liberation, and it's about waking up to injustice. But anything can be taken to an extreme, and there's a lot of extreme wokeism that is not helpful, in the way that there is sometimes combating against people who people are fighting against people and they don't understand the other person's intentions, their values, and what those practices are really about. And I've seen a lot of this, especially being queer and being in the spiritual community, that queer people have a lot of this energy in our community in general. People have been really offended and upset that I've hosted cacao ceremonies before, because cacao ceremony comes from a Mayan culture. However, cacao ceremony has not been incorporated into Mayan cultures in hundreds of years after colonization. And the movement of doing cacao ceremonies is actually restoring something that colonization has erased. So it's very hypocritical in a way to say that we want to respect indigenous ways, yet at the same time say that we're not allowed to do it when the people themselves who originally practiced that are no longer doing that in the same way. And it's actually the Western influence in Guatemala that resurged cacao ceremonies and made that commonplace again. But a lot of people don't want to hear that and don't understand that. And I find that personally very frustrating. Another common thing here is that people are saying things like white people can't have dreadlocks. And I even have mixed opinions about having these myself. I don't have very many. It's an experiment. I love to experiment and change, make little alterations with my appearance over time to just embody the energy of transformation. And part of my enjoyment of these is to ruffle the feathers of people who think things like this. Because first of all, dreadlocks are not just a part of African and African American cultures, it's also a part of Indian culture called jata. It is something that spiritual sadhus, renunciates, do as a means of symbolizing their devotion to spirit. And the take of the Indian people that I have met in terms of Western and white people practicing their spirituality is very different than what a lot of extra extreme woke people think. And many Indian people, especially those that are more religious, are really enthralled and really, really happy when somebody that isn't from their culture is interested in Hinduism, yoga, or meditation and practices it. They are very excited when other people come to their temples and enjoy their practices and learn from their ways. I went to many temples, and Indian people were enthralled that I was there, and it wasn't just that I donated to the temples too. This isn't true in every part of India. There's a lot of parts of India where it isn't true. So I can't speak about all Indian people, but I did experience a lot of, yes, welcome. We want you to do this with us. And I experienced that with so many cultures in South America too, in Mexico as well. There is a way that these indigenous people want their way and their medicine to be shared because they know that this is the healing medicine for the earth, and that when other people receive it, that it's changing their lives and transforming not just those people, but it's transforming the planet. And so a lot of these people who come with these big criticisms of spiritual practices as cultural appropriation don't take into consideration that oftentimes these ways have been passed on, and that people who aren't a part of the initial cultures are actually inheriting the cultural lineage through it being passed down, through the consent of the original culture. And understanding intentions is really important. And intention doesn't always mean that one doesn't cause harm. There are really inappropriate things that happen. For example, uninitiated, non-indigenous people wearing headdresses when they haven't been given that headdress by an indigenous person, and they wear it not as a ceremonial thing, but for example at a festival. I'm not saying that that is absolutely 100% wrong, but I personally don't agree with it, and I have a bit of critique about that, and I understand why people are offended about that. And so I'm, again, as per usual, falling in the middle path, as that is my core intention and part of my values and beliefs, is actually to create peace. Though I found myself very frustrated with people on either ends of these extremes, both believing that they can do literally anything they want, or criticizing people who are actually authentic, pure in their intentions, and might even be lineage holders because they have inherited it and they've been gifted those gifts by indigenous leaders. So this is a vast subject, and it's one that a lot of people don't have the capacity to show up for, and I'm learning to have more capacity to show up for. And it requires humility and letting go of the part of us that really wants to be right in these situations, and instead embrace the uncertainty and embrace that desire for peace and connection and compassion and understanding of each other. And when we do that, we can really see where the other people are coming from. I made a mistake in that workshop, and instead I should have first felt and heard that person's good intention. Though what I felt and heard was their anger and resentment that brought that same energy about in me. And that's not what I want to do. So I will say that we need the ancient ways and we need the modern ways. This is a video on YouTube. We have so many technologies out there. AI and so many things are having, yes, the potential to be used in negative ways, but have a lot of potential to be used in positive ways as well. And whether we like it or not, we are upgrading our world. However, it is an ancient future where these new technologies can then be paired with the ancient technologies to heal so much of the harm and damage that we've caused to ourselves and to the planet. So I hope you found this conversation interesting and it shed some light on some things for you. And yeah, backtracking a moment, I have friends who have had full heads, full dread heads, and they share that their experience is that so many white people judge and criticize and say mean things to them, but when they meet African Americans or African people, they are met with a lot of love and admiration. They really appreciate and like it. Of course, there are some who don't like it, but that hasn't been these individuals' experiences, and that's never been my experience. I've never been judged for having these by anyone who isn't white. And actually, mine were made partially by a woman from Mexico, partially by a friend of mine who's trans, partially by somebody who is from Thailand who had a full head of dreads himself. And so I think that would be an interesting reflection as well for these people. If this is wrong and this is insulting to Indigenous people, then why did Indigenous people put it in my head? There's a much different attitude towards cultural sharing in the developing world within Indigenous cultures than is held in America or Canada and Europe. So we need to open our minds, and I would encourage you to not speak on behalf of cultures that are not your own, because I think that itself is a form of, it's not appropriation, but it's some sort of cultural insertion. It's saying, me and with my big ego, I have a right to speak on behalf of a culture that isn't mine. Everybody within every culture is going to have a different opinion. We can't make these generalizations of what is right and what is wrong, but we can assess a person's intention. And when it comes down to this subject, people carrying Indigenous wisdom for the purpose of healing have positive intentions for the most part. Of course, some people are using that just for money, but there's many who aren't. So you have to assess that on a case-by-case basis. Is American Spirit Tobacco using Indigenous symbology with positive intention? No. So before we point the finger at individuals, we have to recognize where cultural appropriation is used in a negative way by the bigger players in this world. And yeah, open your hearts, open your minds, understand other people's intentions, and meet them with love. And this is going to be a much better, happier, and healthier world. That's all I have to say. So subscribe to my YouTube channel to get more content and get more information. More of my videos are about channeling and healing, but this one was a special one that wanted to come through. I'm available for sessions as well. And let me know what you think about this and what your opinion is. I'd really love to hear from more people. Hope you have a really fantastic day. Much love, blessings, and light to all.